The March air in lower Manhattan carried that peculiar blend of exhaust fumes and opportunity that Meredith had never quite learned to love. She stood across from the New York Stock Exchange shoulder wedged against cold limestone, watching the celebration unfold behind glass walls she couldn't penetrate. Not that she wanted to. The champagne being poured on the trading floor cost more per bottle than she'd spent on rent last month, and every cork that popped felt like another small detonation in the carefully constructed lie her ex-husband had been selling for the past 4 months. Garrison Ashford looked good up there. He always did. 6'1" shoulders that filled out Tom Ford the way the designer probably dreamed about when he was sketching that particular shade of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. The camera flashes caught the silver at his temples, distinguished now, not premature, and Meredith wondered if he'd planned that too, the way he'd planned everything else. Let a little gray show through. Make them think you've earned this through years of grinding wisdom. She touched the gold bracelet on her left wrist, the metal worn smooth from 60 years of being worn by 2 women who understood that survival meant keeping your mouth shut until you had something worth saying. Nana Jo had fastened it there the morning Meredith left for college, back when the world still felt like something you could navigate if you were just smart enough and worked hard enough and didn't let bastards convince you their dreams mattered more than yours. Turns out Nana Jo had been right about a lot of things, including Garrison. 4 hours. That's how long Meredith had given herself to sit with the rage before she burned his entire empire to the ground. 4 hours to remember why she'd loved him once back when his ambition had felt like a shared language instead of a weapon he'd eventually turn against her. 4 hours to touch this bracelet and think about the woman who'd saved tips for 3 years to buy a piece of Gulf Coast land nobody wanted just so her granddaughter would have something nobody could take away. The folder tucked under Meredith's arm contained 16 years of work. Not the glossy pitch deck Garrison was probably waving around up there, all projections and market opportunity and revolutionary this and disruptive that. No, this folder held the real story. Time-stamped code, email chains, a patent application with 1 name where there should have been 2. Her phone buzzed. Darla texting from her nursing shift at Emory. Please tell me you're not actually going through with this. Please tell me you're on a beach somewhere drinking something with an umbrella in it. Meredith typed back, I'm exactly where I need to be. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, that's what I was afraid of. Call me when it's done. I'll have wine ready. The thing about being underestimated your entire life is you learn to use it. Meredith had been 29 when she'd first presented her extraction algorithm to Garrison at that Houston conference, back when she was still naive enough to believe that brilliance spoke for itself. She'd spent 6 months developing the model, running simulations, stress testing it against every variable she could imagine. The precision yield algorithm could increase oil extraction efficiency by 28% while reducing waste by 40%. In an industry where margins lived and died on single-digit improvements, PYA was the kind of breakthrough that made careers. She'd shown it to Garrison over drinks at the hotel bar, her laptop balanced on her knees, too excited to notice the way his eyes had shifted from the screen to her face and back again. Not looking at the code the way an engineer looks at code, looking at it the way a businessman looks at an asset he's just decided to acquire. He'd said, "You're the smartest person I've ever met in this field." She'd believed him. God, she'd believed him. They'd built Ashford Energy Solutions in his mother's garage in Atlanta, back when Victoria still pretended to tolerate the girl from Tennessee who'd somehow convinced her son to waste his Stanford MBA on petroleum engineering. Meredith had worked 18-hour days writing code-building relationships with geologists and landmen and pipeline engineers who'd been in the industry since before she was born. Garrison had handled the business side, the fundraising, the networking, the endless pitches to investors who wanted to see pedigree and polish, not technical specs. For 3 years it had felt like partnership, like they were building something that belonged to both of them equally, even if only one of their names was on the incorporation papers. Meredith had told herself it didn't matter. The work mattered. The innovation mattered. Love mattered. She'd been wrong about which of those things was currency. The first cut had been subtle. a website redesign in 2018 that somehow forgot to include her bio in the leadership section. Garrison had apologized, blamed the contractor, promised to fix it. The fix never came. Then the client meetings where her calendar invite got lost in spam. The pitch sessions where Garrison presented her analysis but framed it as our team's research instead of Meredith's research. The gradual, methodical erasure of her fingerprints from every surface she'd touched. By 2020, she'd been relegated to the kids' table at Christmas dinner at the Ashford estate, literally, sandwiched between Garrison's nephew, who was practicing his recorder, and his niece, who kept flicking mashed potatoes at the dog. Victoria had arranged the seating chart with the kind of surgical precision she usually reserved for her garden club politics, and Meredith had sat there feeling rage crystallize in her chest, while Preston Garrison's lawyer brother had given a toast about family and legacy and knowing your place in the world. Darla had called an hour later, voice shaking with fury. "Tell me you threw a plate. Tell me you at least threw a fork." Meredith had said, "I'm documenting everything." Because that's what you did when you were building a case. You documented. You waited. You let them think the silence meant surrender instead of strategy. Kendra Cross had entered the story in 2021, introduced by Preston at some charity function Victoria had organized to launder the family's reputation through strategic philanthropy. Kendra was 30 then, whip-smart with an MBA from Vanderbilt and a resume that screamed competence in exactly the language investors understood. She'd been brought on as a finance consultant, but Meredith had recognized the play immediately. This wasn't about improving cash flow projections. This was about replacement. Victoria had made sure Kendra sat next to Garrison at every dinner. Preston had arranged for her to review every contract, every deal structure, every partnership agreement. Within 6 months, Garrison had an apartment downtown for late work nights. He'd said, as if Meredith was stupid enough to believe that excuse, as if the smell of unfamiliar perfume on his collar was just coincidence, as if the way Kendra looked at him across conference tables was professional interest instead of possession. Meredith had said nothing, had signed nothing, had simply watched and documented and waited for them to make the mistake she knew was coming. It came in March 2024, buried in a folder on the company server Garrison had forgotten to lock her out of. Patent application number US 202408891, filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office on February 14th. Valentine's Day. Garrison probably thought that was poetic. The application was for the precision yield algorithm, the breakthrough that had built Ashford Energy Solutions from a garage startup to a company worth $480 million. The code Meredith had written line by line, variable by variable, over 6 months in 2016, while Garrison was still learning the difference between extraction and refining. The inventor field listed one name, Garrison Ashford, sole inventor. Meredith had printed the application, walked downstairs to the penthouse living room where Garrison was reviewing IPO documents, and laid the papers on his lap without saying a word. Had watched his face cycle through surprise to guilt to calculation to defiance in under 10 seconds. He'd said, "We built this together. I refined it significantly." She'd said, "Lines 1 through 2,847 are mine. You added 93 lines of comments." He'd said, "Legally, company IP belongs to the company. I am the company now." The next morning, divorce papers arrived via courier. Victoria's fingerprints were all over the filing. The speed, the precision, the prenup clause that had been buried in page 47 of their marriage agreement that Meredith had signed in 2015 when she was still young enough to believe love was more important than leverage. $50,000. That's what 9 years of marriage and 16 years of work was worth, according to Garrison's lawyers. $50,000 and the cottage in Tennessee that Meredith's mother had left her, the one with foundation problems and a roof that leaked when it rained hard. Plus, one critical clause: wife waives all claims to company intellectual property, trade secrets, and derivative works created during marriage. Garrison's attorney had looked so smug delivering those papers. Silver-haired and expensive, the kind of lawyer who billed in 6-minute increments and treated women like obstacles to be negotiated around. He'd actually said, "Mrs. Ashford, I advise you to accept these terms. Litigation would be expensive and ultimately futile. You signed a prenup. You have no claim to company assets." Meredith had read every page, had made him wait in the living room for 40 minutes while she reviewed each clause, each waiver, each carefully constructed trap, had finally signed her name at the bottom and handed the papers back with a smile that made the attorney's professional mask slip for just a second. She'd said, "Tell Garrison he deserves everything he's about to get." The attorney had left, looking confused. Garrison had called an hour later, sounding relieved, probably already planning how to spin the divorce in the IPO narrative. The brilliant founder who'd sacrificed his marriage to build something revolutionary. The media loved that story. The lonely genius misunderstood by everyone except the smart, ambitious woman who finally understood his vision. Kendra would play that role beautifully. She already was. What Garrison didn't know, what his expensive attorney hadn't caught, what Victoria's decades of social maneuvering hadn't prepared them for, was that the waiver only applied to IP created during the marriage. The patent application had been filed in February 2024, 4 months after their separation. And the algorithm itself had been created in 2016 when Meredith was still Meredith Callaway, before she'd made the mistake of thinking her name should match his. Also, he'd forgotten about Nana Joe. Franklin Lockhart had been practicing petroleum law for 42 years when Meredith met him at an industry mixer in Houston back in 2010. She'd been 25 then, fresh from Tennessee with a degree from UT and a job at a consulting firm that paid barely enough to cover rent in a city where ambition cost more than oxygen. Frank had noticed her because she'd actually read the Henderson Geological Survey everyone else was pretending to understand while holding wine that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. He'd said, "You're the only person in this room who knows what aquifer dynamics actually means." She'd said, "I'm also the only person in this room who can't afford to fake it." They'd been friends ever since, not mentor and student. Frank hated that dynamic, said it was too paternal, too limiting. Colleagues, he'd called them, people who respected each other's intelligence enough to tell the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. When Meredith had called him the day she'd found Garrison's patent application, Frank had been on a plane from Houston to Atlanta within 3 hours. He'd walked into her apartment carrying a leather briefcase that was older than she was, and looked at the evidence she'd compiled with the expression of a man who'd seen this particular betrayal so many times he could recite the patterns in his sleep. He'd said, "This is prosecutable. Patent fraud. Potentially criminal, definitely civil. You have timestamps, email chains, version control history. GitHub commits don't lie." Meredith had said, "What else do I have?" Frank had set down his briefcase and pulled out a folder she'd never seen before. Inside was a trust document dated October 2019, signed by Josephine Eleanor Whitmore and witnessed by Frank himself. Meredith's hands had shaken reading it. The Gulf Coast property, 2.3 acres, her grandmother had bought in 1978 for $8,000 paid for with tips saved from working double shifts at Pat's Diner. Land that Nana Joe had always called her insurance policy, the thing she'd bought so her granddaughter would always have ground to stand on that nobody could claim. The trust listed Meredith Adelaide Callaway as sole beneficiary. Not Meredith Ashford. Callaway. The structure protected the property from marital claims, bankruptcy proceedings, any kind of legal action that might come after her through Garrison's debts or ambitions. Frank had said, "Your grandmother called me in 2019. Said she had a feeling about your husband. Couldn't prove anything, just 60 years of knowing men well enough to see the pattern. She wanted to make sure you had something protected." Meredith had touched the bracelet on her wrist and felt the weight of being loved by someone who'd understood survival better than she ever would. Frank had continued, "I took the liberty of commissioning a geological survey last year, paid for it through the trust. Your grandmother authorized the expense before she passed." He'd slid a second document across the table. Seismic imaging, core samples, reserve estimates, the kind of analysis that cost 6 figures and took specialized equipment and expertise that most independent prospectors couldn't afford. The land held $16 billion in recoverable oil reserves, plus another $4 billion in natural gas deposits. Meredith had said she knew. Frank had shook his head. She suspected the land might have value, but the survey results surprised even me. The geology is remarkably similar to the Permian Basin formations. Your grandmother bought one of the most valuable unproven reserves in the Gulf Coast region because it was cheap enough for a waitress to afford. $20 billion. That's what Nana Joe's intuition and 3 years of saved tips had turned into. $20 billion in the ground, protected by a trust structure that Garrison and his lawyers had no idea existed. Meredith had asked, "What do we do with this?" Frank had said, "Whatever you want. But I'd suggest we use it as leverage, not an escape route. The algorithm is about justice. The land is about making sure justice has teeth." So they'd built a strategy. Not revenge. Meredith was careful about that distinction. Revenge was emotional, messy, the kind of thing that made you feel good for 5 minutes and left you with nothing but ashes and regret. Justice was structural, permanent, the kind of thing that changed the foundation so thoroughly that the building couldn't help but collapse. Frank had filed the patent interference claim in April, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. The claim challenged Garrison's application on grounds of prior art and fraudulent inventor designation. It included all the evidence. Meredith had compiled time-stamped files from her laptop email chains dating back to 2016. GitHub commits showing 2,847 contributions to the PYA codebase, all from her account. Technical notebooks with her handwriting dated and witnessed by 3 different petroleum engineers who'd consulted on early versions. The USPTO had accepted the claim and opened an investigation. Garrison's lawyers had filed a motion to dismiss, citing the prenup waiver. Frank had responded with documentation proving the code predated the marriage clause and the patent application postdated the separation, making the waiver irrelevant on both ends. The case was still pending when Ashford Energy announced its IPO in July. Garrison had bet everything on the assumption that Meredith couldn't fight, didn't have the resources or the stamina or the sheer bloody-minded determination to take him on in a legal battle that could stretch for years. He'd underestimated her. They all had. The smart girl from Tennessee who'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through engineering school, who'd built an algorithm that could change an entire industry, who'd loved a man stupid enough to think theft was the same as innovation. Meredith checked her watch. 3 hours and 42 minutes until the gala started. Garrison had sent her an invitation, probably at Victoria's suggestion. Some kind of power play, forcing her to watch him celebrate the company she'd built, the innovation she'd created, the success he'd stolen. The invitation had arrived at her apartment with a handwritten note. "You were there at the beginning. Come celebrate how far we've come." She'd RSVP'd immediately, "I'll be there." Because she would be. Not to celebrate, to execute. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Frank. "Richard Hale just confirmed. He'll be at the plaza by 8. Everything's in place." Richard Hale was 70 years old, built his fortune in Texas oil before most of the current industry players were born, and had a reputation for backing innovation that actually worked, instead of innovation that just sounded good in pitch meetings. Frank had approached him 6 weeks ago with the geological survey and the extraction projections, and Richard had spent a month doing due diligence that would have made the SEC jealous. His offer had come through last week, $18 billion for 30-year extraction rights to the Gulf Coast property, with Meredith retaining ownership and oversight of environmental controls. The deal would close after the IPO, contingent on certain conditions being met, conditions that would be satisfied tonight, one way or another. Meredith watched Garrison through the glass, holding court with investors who probably thought they were buying into the next great American success story. The self-made entrepreneur who'd built a revolutionary company from scratch. The visionary who'd seen opportunities everyone else missed. The genius behind the precision yield algorithm that was going to transform the energy industry. She wondered if any of them had actually read the prospectus. Really read it, not just the executive summary and the financial projections. Page 47, buried in the risk factors section, there was a single paragraph about ongoing patent disputes that management believes are without merit and will be resolved in the company's favor. That was her. The meritless dispute. The nuisance claim that Garrison's lawyers had assured investors would disappear once the IPO went through, and Ashford Energy had real money for real litigation. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The celebration inside was winding down. Garrison shaking hands, Kendra at his side, wearing a dress that probably cost what Meredith used to make in a month. Victoria circulating through the crowd with that particular smile she reserved for people she was trying to impress, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Preston talking to someone who looked like SEC counsel, probably getting ahead of questions about the patent dispute. Meredith's phone buzzed one more time. "Darla, again, whatever you're about to do, I support you. Also, I already bought the wine. The expensive kind. You've earned it." She typed back, 4 hours, then it's done. She touched the bracelet one last time, feeling the weight of everything Nana Jo had taught her without ever putting it into words. That survival meant patience, that justice meant preparation, that the only thing they couldn't take from you was what you built on ground that belonged to you alone. The gold felt warm against her skin, worn smooth from decades of being worn by two women who'd understood that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Garrison's celebration was ending. The real party was about to begin, and Meredith had been planning this moment for 16 years. Frank's office in Houston smelled like old leather and older money, the kind of space where deals had been made back when handshakes still meant something, and a man's word was the only contract that mattered. Meredith had flown in the morning after signing the divorce papers, carrying nothing but the folder of evidence and a rage so pure it felt like clarity. Frank had spread the documents across his mahogany desk with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. Patent application, email chains, code repositories, technical notebooks. Each piece of evidence another nail in the coffin Garrison was building for himself. The GitHub analysis alone was devastating. 2,847 commits to the PYA codebase between March 2016 and November 2019, every single one from an account registered to Meredith C_dev. The commit messages told the story of the algorithm's development in granular detail. Initial framework for precision yield calculation, refactored extraction efficiency module, fixed boundary condition bug in waste reduction function, optimized runtime from ON squared to ON log n. Garrison had made exactly 93 commits in that same period. 86 of them were formatting changes. 7 were comments explaining code he hadn't written. Frank had looked up from the screen bifocals, catching the afternoon light. This isn't a legal gray area. This is fraud. Provable, prosecutable fraud. Meredith had touched the bracelet. "What's the timeline?" Frank had pulled out a calendar already marked with annotations in his precise handwriting. "Patent interference claim takes 6 to 9 months minimum. We file in April. Realistically, we're looking at October or November for a preliminary ruling. But here's the interesting part." He'd tapped the Ashford Energy Prospectus, the glossy document that laid out Garrison's vision for transforming the petroleum industry. The IPO is scheduled for August. They're betting the patent dispute won't matter by then. Once they're public, they'll have real capital for extended litigation. They think they can bury you in legal fees until you run out of money or stamina or both. Meredith had felt something cold settle in her chest. "So we need to move faster." Frank had smiled, the expression of a man who'd been waiting decades to deploy a particular strategy. "We need to move smarter. The patent claim puts pressure on their timeline. Every investor doing due diligence will see an ongoing IP dispute. Some will walk away. Others will demand warranties and indemnities that'll cost Ashford Energy millions in insurance premiums. But that's not enough." He'd opened his briefcase and pulled out the trust documents. "This is enough." The geological survey had been commissioned in June 2023, 8 months before Meredith discovered Garrison's patent application. Frank had hired Petrodynamics, the same firm that did reserve analysis for the majors Exxon, Chevron, the companies that couldn't afford to be wrong about what was in the ground. The analysis had taken 3 months: seismic imaging, core samples, pressure testing, formation analysis. The results had come back in September. Proven reserves of 340 million barrels of oil at $120 per barrel, current market price. probable reserves adding another 180 million barrels. Natural gas deposits estimated at 8.4 trillion cubic feet. Frank had walked Meredith through the math. At current extraction costs and market prices, we're looking at $16 billion in oil revenue, another $4 billion in gas. Conservative estimates assuming no major price shifts and standard drilling technology. Meredith had stared at the numbers until they stopped feeling real. Nana Joe bought this land for $8,000. Frank's voice had gone soft the way it did when he was talking about something that mattered beyond contracts and clauses. Your grandmother called me in October 2019. I'd met her twice before at your wedding and when you brought her to that industry dinner in Houston. Sharp woman, didn't miss much. He'd pulled out a handwritten letter, Nana Joe's elegant script on cream stationery. She said she had a feeling about Garrison. Nothing she could prove, just instinct built from 6 decades of watching men. She wanted to set up a trust for the land, make sure it was protected from any claims that might come through your marriage. Meredith had read the letter 3 times. Vision blurring, she died in January 2020. Frank had nodded. 4 months after we finalized the trust. She made me promise not to tell you unless you needed it. Said you were strong enough to build your own life, but she wanted you to have a foundation nobody could kick out from under you. The trust structure was elegant in its simplicity. Meredith Adelaide Callaway, her maiden name, the identity that existed before Garrison and would exist after, was listed as sole beneficiary. Frank served as trustee, managing the property according to instructions Nana Joe had spelled out with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching powerful people find loopholes in other people's security. The land couldn't be claimed in divorce proceedings, couldn't be seized for debts incurred during the marriage, couldn't be touched by any legal action targeting Meredith Ashford because Meredith Ashford didn't own it. Meredith Callaway did. Frank had commissioned the geological survey using trust funds the way Nana Joe had authorized him to do if he ever suspected the property might have value beyond sentimental. The results had sat in his safe for 6 months while he watched Meredith's marriage disintegrate and waited for the moment when she'd need leverage more than she needed escape. That moment had arrived when Garrison filed for divorce. Frank had said, "We have 2 paths. Path 1. You take the survey results, shop them to the majors, sell extraction rights for enough money to never work again. Start fresh somewhere else. Let Garrison have his stolen algorithm and his fraudulent patent and his public company built on intellectual theft." Meredith had looked at him. What's path 2? Frank had leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Path 2 is more complicated. We use the land as leverage, not an exit strategy. We file the patent interference claim and let it run its course. We let Garrison proceed with his IPO, let him build his house of cards as high as it'll go. And then, at exactly the right moment, we prove that the foundation is rotten. The strategy had taken shape over the next 2 weeks. Frank brought in a patent attorney from Dallas, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in IP fraud cases and had a success rate that made opposing counsel check their malpractice insurance. Sarah had reviewed the evidence and delivered her assessment with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how the game would play out. Sarah had said, "The prenup waiver is irrelevant. The code was created before the waiver clause existed, and the patent application was filed after the marriage ended. They have no legal leg to stand on." She'd laid out the timeline. We file interference in April. USPTO accepts the claim because the evidence is overwhelming. Garrison's lawyers file to dismiss citing the prenup. We counter with creation dates and application dates. Judge denies dismissal. Discovery begins. Meredith had asked, "How does that affect the IPO?" Sarah had smiled. "Every investor doing due diligence will see an active USPTO investigation into the core asset of the company. The algorithm represents 65% of Ashford Energy's valuation. If that patent is invalidated, the company's worth drops by $300 million overnight. Some investors will walk. Others will demand price reductions. The smart ones will wait to see how the interference claim resolves." Frank had added, "But Garrison won't delay the IPO. He can't. He's already spent 2 years telling investors this is happening in August. If he pushes it back, they'll ask why. If he admits the patent claim is serious, the valuation collapses. His only play is to move forward and hope he can settle with you for enough money to make you go away. Meredith had felt the pieces clicking together. He'll offer to buy me out. Sarah had nodded. Probably 6 figures, maybe 7 if his lawyers are smart. They'll frame it as nuisance value settling a frivolous claim to clear the path for the IPO. They'll make you sign an NDA, a release of all claims and admission that the settlement isn't acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Meredith had said, and when I don't settle, Frank had pulled out another document, this one from Richard Hale's office in Dallas. Then we go to Phase 2. Richard Hale had built his fortune in the Permian Basin back when oil was still flowing free, and fortunes were being made by men who could read geology better than they could read. At 70, he'd survived 3 market crashes, 2 divorces, and more bad deals than he cared to remember. What he hadn't survived was his tolerance for people who built empires on lies. Frank had approached him in May with the Geological Survey and a proposition: what if there was a way to acquire extraction rights to a $20 billion reserve while also preventing a fraud from going public? Richard had spent a month doing his own due diligence, had hired independent analysts to verify the survey results, had his lawyers examine the trust structure for weaknesses, had private investigators background check everyone involved to make sure this wasn't some elaborate scam. His offer had come in mid-June, $18 billion for 30-year extraction rights. Meredith would retain ownership of the land and final approval over all environmental controls. Richard's company would handle drilling infrastructure and operations. Revenue split would be 70-30 in Richard's favor, which was standard for deals where one party provided all the capital and expertise. The contract included one unusual clause. The deal would only close after certain conditions were met regarding the validity of patents related to petroleum extraction technology. Richard's lawyers had been very specific about the language. They didn't want to acquire rights to land from someone who might be embroiled in litigation that could complicate their title. The subtext was clear. Prove Garrison stole your algorithm, and we have a deal. Frank had negotiated one additional term: Richard would attend Ashford Energy's IPO celebration gala. Not as an investor, he had no intention of putting money into a company built on fraud, but as a potential partner in Meredith's future ventures. His presence would be a signal to everyone in the room who understood how the industry worked. Meredith Callaway wasn't some spurned ex-wife making noise. She was someone Richard Hale took seriously enough to show up for. The pieces were in place by July. Patent interference claim filed and accepted. Discovery requests submitted. Garrison's lawyers scrambling to manage a dispute they'd assured investors was frivolous, and Meredith quietly building the case that would dismantle everything her ex-husband had stolen. She'd moved out of Atlanta in May, couldn't stand being in a city where Victoria's influence touched every social circle, and Garrison's success was celebrated in business journals that never mentioned the woman who'd written the code. Found a small apartment in Houston close enough to Frank's office that she could walk there when the walls started closing in. Darla had helped her pack throwing Garrison's leftover belongings into trash bags with therapeutic violence. I cannot believe you're not keeping any of this. The espresso machine alone is worth $2,000. Meredith had been folding clothes into boxes. I don't want anything that reminds me I was stupid enough to think he'd changed. Darla had stopped mid-throw. You weren't stupid, you were optimistic. There's a difference. Meredith had touched the bracelet. Nana Joe would have seen through him immediately. Darla had sat down on the floor next to her. Nana Joe had 60 years of practice. You had love. That's not stupidity, babe. That's just being human. The weeks between filing the patent claim and Garrison's IPO had been strange. Meredith existed in a liminal space, neither fighting nor surrendering, just waiting for the machinery of justice to grind through its processes. She'd taken a consulting job with a small firm in Houston, nothing demanding, just enough to pay rent and keep her engineering skills sharp. Spent her evenings reviewing legal documents with Frank and her weekends hiking trails outside the city, trying to remember who she'd been before Garrison had convinced her that her identity should be tied to his. The settlement offer arrived in mid-July, delivered by courier to Frank's office. $250,000 in exchange for withdrawing the patent interference claim and signing a mutual non-disparagement agreement. The letter from Garrison's attorney had been carefully worded to sound generous, in the interest of avoiding protracted litigation and recognizing Mrs. Ashford's early contributions to algorithm development. Our client is prepared to offer. Frank had read it aloud in a voice dripping with contempt. Early contributions, like you were an intern who helped with research instead of the person who wrote every meaningful line of code. Meredith had said, counter offer. Frank had smiled. We don't counter, we ignore. Let them think you're considering it. Let Garrison proceed with the IPO, believing you'll fold at the last minute. Then we show up at his celebration and burn it all down. The invitation to the gala had arrived the same week, embossed cardstock with Garrison's handwriting on the back. You were there at the beginning. Come celebrate how far we've come. The presumption of it had stolen Meredith's breath. Come celebrate how far we've come, as if the journey had been shared, as if the success belonged to both of them, as if theft could be transmuted into partnership through the alchemy of selective memory. She'd RSVP'd the same day. I'll be there. Because she would be, not to celebrate, to execute. The Plaza Hotel had been Garrison's choice because of course it was. Everything about the IPO celebration screamed old money trying to look like new success. The ballroom could hold 400 people comfortably, which meant Garrison had invited exactly 400 people because leaving seats empty would suggest he couldn't fill the room. The guest list read like a directory of everyone who'd ever mattered in petroleum finance. Investment bankers, hedge fund managers, family offices looking for the next big energy play, journalists from the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes analysts who'd written glowing profiles of Garrison's vision for transforming extraction technology. Meredith had chosen her outfit with the same strategic precision she'd used to build the algorithm navy dress that looked expensive without being showy, simple jewelry, except for the gold bracelet hair pulled back in a way that said professional rather than celebratory. She looked like someone who'd been invited out of courtesy, not someone who was about to detonate the evening's carefully constructed narrative. Frank had arrived at her hotel room at 6 to review the plan one final time. He'd brought Sarah, the patent attorney, and Marcus Webb, a former USPTO examiner Frank had retained as an expert witness. Marcus had spent 3 decades reviewing patent applications and could explain to a jury or a ballroom full of investors exactly how someone could tell the difference between original invention and intellectual theft. Sarah had laid out the evidence on the hotel desk. The time-stamped code files prove creation date. The email chains prove Garrison acknowledged your authorship. The GitHub commits prove you did the development work. The technical notebooks prove the algorithm's evolution. Any one of these would be strong evidence. All 4 together is overwhelming. Marcus had added, I've reviewed the patent application line by line. Garrison's claim of sole inventorship is legally indefensible. Even if he'd made significant improvements, which the code history shows he didn't, patent law requires listing all inventors who contributed to the claimed invention. Deliberately omitting a co-inventor is fraud. Frank had checked his watch. Richard lands at LaGuardia at 7:30. He'll meet us at the plaza by 8:15. That gives Garrison an hour to enjoy his triumph before we begin dismantling it. Meredith had looked at the 3 of them, attorney, expert, mentor, and felt something shift in her chest. For 16 years, she'd believed that competence was enough, that if you were smart enough and worked hard enough, the world would recognize your value, that merit was currency and innovation spoke for itself. She'd been wrong. Competence without leverage was just unpaid labor waiting to be stolen. But she had leverage now. The ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people made in a year. White linen on every table, centerpieces of orchids that had been flown in from somewhere exotic, champagne flowing like water, because Garrison had always believed that excess was the same thing as success. Meredith took her assigned seat at table 14 near the back of the room, but not quite against the wall, close enough to see everything, far enough to be forgettable. The table's other occupants were clearly B-list invites. A mid-level analyst from a regional bank, someone's +1 who looked uncomfortable in his rented tux, a journalist from a trade publication that nobody important read. They made polite conversation that died quickly when they realized Meredith had no interest in pretending tonight was a celebration. The room filled quickly. Investors in suits that cost what Meredith used to make in a month. Victoria holding court with Atlanta's social elite, every word calculated to reinforce the narrative that her son was a visionary genius. Preston working the room with lawyer efficiency, probably doing damage control on the patent dispute before anyone thought to ask uncomfortable questions. And Kendra. Kendra in a gold dress that caught light like a trophy standing next to Garrison with her hand on his arm in a way that said ownership rather than affection. She looked perfect up there, the kind of woman who understood that success was a performance, and she'd been cast in the role of leading lady. Garrison took the podium at 8 sharp microphone feedback cutting through the ambient conversation. He looked good, confident. The consummate entrepreneur about to take his company public and prove that vision plus execution equaled transformation. His speech hit all the expected notes. Humble beginnings in his mother's garage, the challenges of building a startup in a risk-averse industry, the moment of breakthrough when he developed the precision yield algorithm that would revolutionize extraction efficiency. He thanked his investors for believing in the vision. He thanked his team for their dedication. He thanked his mother for her unwavering support. He never mentioned Meredith's name, not once. Not even in the carefully sanitized history of the company's founding, where he acknowledged there had been early team members who contributed to our initial research before moving on to other opportunities. As if Meredith had been an intern who'd helped with PowerPoint slides before deciding petroleum engineering wasn't her calling. The rage that had sustained Meredith through 6 months of legal preparation crystallized into something colder. Not hot anger that made you sloppy. Ice-clear fury that made you precise. Garrison pulled Kendra forward, microphone in hand. I want to thank the woman who believed in this vision when others doubted, who saw the potential in what we were building and helped turn it into reality. Kendra took the microphone with practiced grace. When I first met Garrison, I knew I was meeting someone special, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge conventional thinking and build something revolutionary. She looked directly at table 14 when she said it, gaze landing on Meredith for just a second, long enough to make sure Meredith understood the message. You're irrelevant now. This is my place. These are my people. This success belongs to us. Meredith touched the bracelet and thought about Nana Joe watching men underestimate women for 60 years, documenting their arrogance for future use. Thought about the geological survey sitting in Frank's briefcase. Thought about Richard Hale's plane landing at LaGuardia right about now. Thought about the fact that in approximately 15 minutes, 400 people were going to learn the difference between innovation and theft. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened at 8:16. Frank entered first, briefcase in hand, Sarah and Marcus following close behind. They moved through the crowd with the purposeful momentum of people who had somewhere specific to be and weren't interested in small talk. Garrison noticed. Meredith watched his expression shift from confident to confused to concerned in the space between one sentence and the next. He recovered quickly. He'd always been good at performing confidence even when he was drowning, but the damage was done. The investors who knew Frank by reputation had already started whispering. Then Richard Hale walked through the doors. At 70, Richard moved like a man who'd spent his life on drilling platforms and in boardrooms where a single wrong word could cost millions. He wasn't tall, wasn't physically imposing, but he carried authority the way some men carry weapons. Everyone in the industry knew who he was. Everyone knew that Richard Hale didn't show up to events unless there was a reason that mattered. He walked directly to table 14, pulled out the chair next to Meredith, sat down like he'd been invited. The whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire through dry grass. Richard Hale was at the Ashford Energy IPO gala. Richard Hale was sitting with someone nobody recognized. Richard Hale was here, which meant something was happening that nobody had been told about. Garrison's speech stumbled. He'd been mid-sentence about projected expansion into new markets when Richard walked in, and suddenly the words coming out of his mouth sounded hollow, even to the people who'd been nodding along moments before. Victoria made eye contact with Preston. Preston pulled out his phone, probably texting Garrison's attorney something urgent and alarmed. Kendra's grip on Garrison's arm tightened, knuckles going white against the dark fabric of his suit. Richard leaned close to Meredith, voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Frank tells me you're ready." Meredith looked at the man who'd stolen 16 years of her work, who was standing in front of 400 people claiming credit for innovation he hadn't created, who'd convinced himself that theft was just smart business and women who complained were just bitter ex-wives who couldn't accept being outgrown. She said, "I'm ready." Garrison tried to recover, cleared his throat, smiled at the crowd like Richard's entrance had been planned all along, like powerful men showing up unannounced was just another Tuesday in the life of a successful entrepreneur. The microphone caught the slight tremor in his voice when he continued. "As I was saying, the future of Ashford Energy is built on innovation that transforms how we think about extraction efficiency." But the room had shifted. Investors who'd been nodding along were now checking phones, probably Googling why Richard Hale was sitting with a woman nobody recognized at table 14. The journalists had their cameras out, recording not because Garrison's speech was compelling, but because something unexpected was unfolding, and they had instincts honed by years of covering stories where the interesting part happened off script. Frank stood, not dramatically, just rose from his seat with the quiet authority of someone who'd been doing this for 42 years and knew exactly how much power lived in deliberate movement. He walked toward the podium carrying his briefcase, each step measured, giving the room time to understand that whatever was happening wasn't accidental. Garrison stopped mid-sentence, watched Frank approach with an expression that cycled through confusion to recognition to something approaching panic. They'd met before years ago, back when Meredith had brought Frank to a company event and introduced him as her mentor. Garrison had been dismissive, then probably thought Frank was just some old attorney coasting toward retirement, not worth cultivating. That miscalculation was about to cost him everything. Frank reached the podium, extended his hand. "Garrison, it's been a while." Garrison shook it automatically, corporate reflex overriding judgment. "Frank, I didn't realize you were on the guest list." Frank's smile could have cut glass. "I wasn't. But my client was, and I thought she might need support this evening." The word client landed like a grenade. 400 people watching, most of them smart enough to understand that attorneys didn't show up to IPO celebrations to support clients unless there was litigation involved. The whispers intensified. Garrison's lawyer, the expensive one from the firm Victoria had retained, was already moving through the crowd, phone pressed to his ear, probably calling the senior partner asking what the hell protocol was when opposing counsel crashed your client's public celebration. Frank opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, pulled out a document. "I have something here that I think will interest the investors in this room. It's a filing from the United States Patent and Trademark Office regarding patent application number US 202408891, the precision yield algorithm that Mr. Ashford has been describing as the core innovation of Ashford Energy Solutions." Preston appeared at Garrison's elbow, whispered something urgent. Garrison shook his head, probably some instinct telling him that trying to shut this down would only make it worse. Better to let Frank speak and control the narrative afterward. Fatal mistake. Frank projected the document onto the screen behind Garrison, replacing the glossy slide about projected revenue with dense legal text. "This is a notice of interference proceeding. It was filed in April and accepted by the USPTO in May. It challenges Mr. Ashford's claim of sole inventorship on the grounds that the algorithm in question was actually created by someone else." The room went silent, not the polite quiet of people listening to a speech, the heavy silence of people realizing they might have made a very expensive mistake. Frank continued, voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "The algorithm was created between March and November of 2016 by Meredith Callaway. Every line of meaningful code, every optimization, every breakthrough that makes this technology valuable." He clicked to the next slide, GitHub commit history. 2,847 contributions from Meredith C_dev, time-stamped and documented. The dates were clear. The authorship was undeniable. Frank said, "These commits were made to a private repository between 2016 and 2019. They show the complete development arc of the precision yield algorithm. Variable naming conventions, code, comments, documentation style, all consistent with a single developer working methodically over time. Next slide, email exchange from August 2017. Garrison's words on the screen impossible to deny. Meredith's algorithm is brilliant. We should patent it together. This could transform the company. Frank let that sit for 5 seconds. Together. Mr. Ashford acknowledged at the time that the innovation belonged to both of them. Yet when he filed his patent application in February of this year, only one name appeared on the inventor designation. The math was brutal. Garrison's credibility disintegrating in real time, each piece of evidence, another shovel full of dirt on the grave he'd dug for himself. Victoria stood diamonds catching chandelier light. This is inappropriate. This is my son's celebration and your... Frank's gaze shifted to her with the weight of 4 decades of courtroom experience. Mrs. Ashford, I'm presenting evidence of patent fraud to investors who are about to put their money into a company whose core asset is built on stolen intellectual property. I'd argue that's extremely appropriate timing. He clicked to the next slide before she could respond. Technical notebook pages. Meredith's handwriting documenting the algorithm's development. Each page dated, some with witness signatures from petroleum engineers who'd consulted on early versions. Frank's voice stayed level, factual, devastating. These notebooks show the evolution of the algorithm's logic. Initial frameworks, failed approaches, breakthrough moments. The kind of detailed development history that only exists when someone is actually doing the work rather than taking credit for it. Garrison finally found his voice, tried to assert control. This is a dispute we've been managing with counsel. It's a nuisance claim without merit and... Meredith stood. The movement cut through Garrison's words more effectively than any objection. 400 pairs of eyes tracked her as she walked toward the front of the room, each step deliberate. She'd spent 16 years being invisible in rooms like this, being the smart woman behind the successful man, the uncredited architect of innovations that carried someone else's name. That ended tonight. She reached the podium. Frank stepped aside, gave her the space. Garrison looked at her with something between confusion and fear, probably realizing for the first time that the quiet woman he'd erased wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. Meredith's voice carried without the microphone. The precision yield algorithm that Garrison just spent 20 minutes describing represents 6 months of work in 2016. I wrote it while we were building Ashford Energy in his mother's garage. Every line of functional code, every optimization that makes it valuable. She clicked to a new slide, side-by-side comparison of code from the GitHub repository and code from Garrison's patent application. Identical. Down to the variable names, the comment syntax, the specific approaches to solving extraction efficiency problems. Meredith said, line 247 through line 2847 are mine. Garrison added lines 2848 through 2940, 93 lines. Most of them comments explaining code he didn't write. Someone in the crowd, probably a developer who understood what they were looking at, let out a low whistle. The investors were on their phones now, typing frantically, probably messaging their analysts to pull every document related to Ashford Energy's IP portfolio. Kendra's hand fell from Garrison's arm. Small movement, but Meredith caught it. The calculation happening behind Kendra's eyes. Stay with the man whose empire is crumbling or distance herself before the wreckage takes her down too. Meredith continued. In 2017, Garrison said we should patent the algorithm together. I believed him. I believed we were building something as partners. That credit would be shared because the work was shared. She clicked to another email, this one from 2018. But by the next year, my name was being removed from the company website. By 2019, I wasn't invited to client meetings anymore. By 2020, I was sitting at the children's table at Christmas dinner while Garrison accepted awards for innovation I'd created. Victoria's face had gone rigid. Preston was typing on his phone with the desperate energy of someone trying to perform damage control on a situation that was already past saving. Meredith said, in February 2024, Garrison filed a patent application claiming sole inventorship of the precision yield algorithm, not co-inventorship, not acknowledging my contribution. Sole credit for work I did 8 years ago." The room was absolutely silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. Meredith's voice stayed steady, factual, but the emotion underneath was impossible to miss. 65% of Ashford Energy's $480 million valuation is based on this algorithm. That's $312 million built on intellectual property that Garrison stole and claimed as his own innovation. She looked directly at the investors. "If you proceed with this IPO, you're buying into a company whose core asset is fraudulent. The patent will be invalidated. The USPTO investigation will likely result in criminal referral, and everyone who invested will be holding shares in a company worth 70% less than you were told." Garrison tried to interrupt. This is a mischaracterization of—" Marcus Webb introduced himself with credentials that carried weight. "I'm Marcus Webb, former senior patent examiner with the USPTO. I've reviewed the evidence Ms. Callaway has presented, and I've reviewed Mr. Ashford's patent application. In my professional opinion, this is one of the clearest cases of inventorship fraud I've encountered in 30 years of patent examination." He let that assessment settle. "The evidence of prior creation is overwhelming. The time-stamped files, the development history, the contemporaneous documentation, all of it points to Ms. Callaway as the true inventor. Mr. Ashford's claim of sole inventorship is legally indefensible and likely criminal." Sarah stood next. "I'm Sarah Chen, intellectual property attorney. I represent Ms. Callaway in the interference proceeding. The prenuptial agreement Mr. Ashford's counsel has cited as defense is irrelevant. The code was created before the marriage's IP waiver clause existed, and the fraudulent patent application was filed after the marriage ended. Mr. Ashford has no legal basis for his claim." The dam broke. Investors standing, some heading for the exits, others surrounding their attorneys demanding immediate consultation. The journalist recording everything probably already writing the headlines, "IPO implodes over patent fraud allegations. Ashford Energy accused of building empire on stolen innovation. CEO's ex-wife produces evidence of intellectual property theft." Richard Hale commanded attention without raising his voice. "For those who don't know me, I'm Richard Hale. I've been in petroleum for 50 years. Built my fortune recognizing real innovation and avoiding fraudulent claims." He looked at Garrison with the expression of someone who'd seen this particular species of ambitious mediocrity too many times. "I've reviewed Ms. Callaway's evidence. I've had my own technical team verify the algorithm's authorship. She created this technology. Mr. Ashford stole it. Anyone investing in this IPO is buying a lawsuit, not a company." Then Richard turned to Meredith, and his voice shifted to something warmer. "Mrs. Callaway and I have been in discussions about a different opportunity. She owns property on the Gulf Coast. Geological surveys indicate it holds approximately $16 billion in recoverable oil and $4 billion in natural gas." The number landed like a physical blow. 16 billion. Meredith Callaway, the woman they'd ignored, the ex-wife they'd dismissed, the invisible architect they'd erased, owned reserves worth more than Ashford Energy's entire projected valuation. Richard continued, "We're negotiating extraction rights. The deal will close once certain patent-related conditions are satisfied, which, based on tonight's revelations, should happen quite soon." He smiled at the room. "I'm investing in Ms. Callaway's future. I'd suggest anyone with money in Ashford Energy consider doing the same." Garrison's lawyer pushed through the crowd, grabbed his client's arm, whispered urgently, probably telling him to shut up, get off stage, let the firm handle damage control. But Garrison jerked away some last desperate attempt to salvage his narrative. "I refined the algorithm significantly. I made it commercially viable. Meredith's original work was theoretical. Meredith clicked to the next slide. Code comparison showing Garrison's refinements. 93 lines of comments. No functional changes, no optimization. No meaningful contribution to the algorithm's core innovation." Her voice cut through his protest. "You added comments explaining my code to investors who wouldn't understand it otherwise. That's not refinement, that's documentation, and it doesn't make you an inventor." She clicked to the final slide, the trust document. Nana Joe's signature at the bottom, dated October 2019. Meredith said, "My grandmother bought that Gulf Coast land in 1978 for $8,000. She was a waitress who saved tips for 3 years because she wanted me to have something nobody could take from me." She touched the bracelet, felt the warmth of metal that had absorbed 60 years of a woman's body heat. She set up a trust in 2019 because she suspected Garrison would eventually try to take everything I'd built. She was right about that. She was right about a lot of things. Meredith looked at Garrison, really looked at him for the first time since the divorce. "You thought I'd accept $50,000 and disappear. You thought I'd sign away my rights because fighting would be expensive and exhausting and ultimately futile. You underestimated me the same way you underestimated the woman who raised me." She stepped away from the podium, voice carrying across the ballroom without the microphone's amplification. "The patent will be invalidated. The IPO will collapse, and everyone who believed your story will learn the difference between innovation and theft." The room erupted, investors demanding answers, board members pulling Garrison aside, Preston trying to get between his brother and the journalists who were already shouting questions. Victoria frozen in place, probably calculating how much damage this would do to the Ashford family reputation she'd spent 40 years polishing. Kendra grabbed her purse. The gold dress that had looked like a trophy 10 minutes ago now just looked expensive and irrelevant. She walked toward the exit without looking back, didn't say goodbye to Garrison, didn't make excuses, just left heels clicking on marble, probably already composing the text message to whatever executive she'd lined up as her next opportunity. Meredith watched her go and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just the cold recognition that some people treated relationships like positions to be filled, and when the position became untenable, they simply moved to the next opening. Frank collected the evidence from the podium, methodical even in chaos. Sarah was already fielding calls from journalists' phone pressed to her ear while she navigated through the crowd. Marcus was being cornered by someone who looked like SEC counsel, probably asking preliminary questions about the fraud claim. Meredith walked over to where Garrison stood, surrounded by attorneys and board members, and the wreckage of his carefully constructed celebration. Up close, she could see how much the past 10 minutes had aged him. The confident entrepreneur who'd been at the podium was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and smaller than she remembered. She said quiet enough that only he could hear, "You could have just put my name on the patent, could have acknowledged what I built, could have treated the past 16 years like they mattered." Garrison's face had gone gray, skin stretched tight over bones. "Meredith, I didn't think you'd actually fight this. The prenup was supposed to—" She held up her hand. "I don't want an apology. I want you to understand what you lost. Not the IPO, not the company. The chance to be someone who kept his word." His eyes were wet now, whether from genuine remorse or just the shock of public humiliation she couldn't tell, and didn't particularly care. "What happens now?" Meredith looked at the ballroom, at the investors streaming toward exits, at Victoria, standing alone near the bar, looking like someone who'd just watched her carefully constructed world detonate. "Now you live with the consequences of choosing theft over integrity." She turned and walked away before he could respond, before whatever words he was forming could land and make her feel obligated to acknowledge them. Frank was waiting near the doors with Richard, both men looking like they'd just executed a particularly satisfying legal maneuver. Richard extended his hand. "That was well done, Ms. Callaway. Measured, professional, devastating." Meredith shook it, felt the calluses that came from decades in an industry that wasn't kind to hands or reputations. "Thank you for being here. Your presence mattered more than you know." Richard's expression was serious. "I've been in this business 50 years, built my fortune on being able to tell the difference between real innovation and smoke. What Garrison did to you isn't just fraud. It's theft of the worst kind, stealing credit for someone else's brilliance and convincing the world it belonged to him." Frank added, "The interference proceedings should conclude in your favor by October. USPTO has enough evidence to invalidate the patent without even going to hearing. After tonight, I doubt Garrison's attorneys will even try to defend it." Sarah joined them, phone finally away. "I've got interview requests from Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Bloomberg. and about 15 trade publications. How do you want to handle media? Meredith thought about it. The strategic part of her brain said, do the interviews control the narrative, make sure the story that gets told is accurate. But the exhausted part, the part that had been carrying this fight for 6 months, and the betrayal for years before that, just wanted to go home and sit in silence. She said, give them a statement. Keep it factual. The evidence speaks for itself. I created the precision yield algorithm in 2016. Garrison Ashford filed a fraudulent patent application claiming sole inventorship. The USPTO accepted my interference claim because the evidence is overwhelming. That's the story. Sarah nodded. What about Garrison? They're going to want your reaction to his downfall. Meredith touched the bracelet, thought about what Nana Joe would say. Tell them I hope he learns something from this, that theft might look like success for a while, but eventually the foundation collapses. And when it does, the only thing you're left with is the truth about who you really are. They walked out of the Plaza Hotel into Manhattan night air that felt cleaner than it had any right to be. The city was alive around them. Taxis and tourists and people living lives that had nothing to do with patent fraud or stolen algorithms or empires built on lies. Meredith stood on the sidewalk watching traffic flow and felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, just the quiet, solid knowledge that she'd done what needed doing. Richard's driver pulled up town car, gleaming under streetlights. Can I offer you all a ride? There's a restaurant 3 blocks from here that makes a decent steak, and I think we could all use a drink and a proper debrief. Frank looked at Meredith. What do you think? She was about to decline, about to say she just wanted to go back to her hotel and process everything in solitude when she realized that wasn't actually what she wanted. What she wanted was to sit with people who'd helped her fight this battle and acknowledge what they'd accomplished together. To mark this moment not with solitary reflection, but with the kind of conversation that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. She said, "Steak sounds good." The restaurant was the kind of place that probably didn't take walk-ins on a Friday night, but Richard Hale's name apparently opened doors that stayed closed for normal people. They were seated in a private corner booth, dim lighting and leather that smelled like old money menus that didn't list prices because if you had to ask, you probably couldn't afford to eat there. Frank ordered Scotch neat. Sarah got wine. Marcus asked for bourbon. Richard ordered for the table steak sides appetizers, the kind of meal that acknowledged they'd earned extravagance. Meredith got water and tried to remember the last time she'd eaten anything more substantial than coffee and determination. The food arrived and they ate in companionable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that came from people who'd worked together long enough to not need constant conversation. It was Frank who finally broke it, raising his glass. To Josephine Whitmore, who understood that the only foundation worth building on is the one that belongs to you alone. They clinked glasses. Meredith felt her throat tighten, blinked back the emotion that threatened to overflow. She would have liked knowing she was right about Garrison. Nana Joe was rarely wrong about people, but she took particular satisfaction in being right about the ones who underestimated her. Richard said, "Tell me about her. About the woman who bought Gulf Coast land in 1978 because she thought her granddaughter deserved ground nobody could kick out from under her." So Meredith told them. About Pat's diner and double shifts and tips saved in an envelope under the mattress. About the thin gold bracelet that Nana Joe had worn every day for 40 years before passing it to her granddaughter with instructions to remember who told her who she was before the world tried to tell her different. About the trust established in 2019 with Frank's help 4 months before Nana Joe died, because 60 years of watching men had taught her to recognize the pattern of betrayal before it fully formed. She told them about Christmas 2020, sitting at the children's table, while Garrison accepted congratulations from family who thought his success was self-made. About the moment in March 2024, when she'd opened that patent application and felt everything she'd built being stolen in real time. About signing divorce papers with a smile because she already knew the prenup clause wouldn't save him. Sarah said, "How did you stay so calm? Most people would have confronted him, immediately burned everything down in the heat of the moment." Meredith thought about it. Nana Joe used to say that rage is expensive but patience is free. That if you wait long enough, people who steal will always show you exactly who they are, and when they do, you want to make sure you have witnesses and evidence instead of just your word against theirs. Frank added, "The trap Garrison fell into is the same one that catches most people who commit fraud. They convince themselves their version of events is true, that they really did refine the algorithm significantly, that their contributions were meaningful, that the patent application was justified. They believe their own lie so completely that they stop being careful." Richard leaned back, swirling bourbon. "I've seen it in my industry more times than I can count. Someone takes credit for another person's work, rides that success to bigger opportunities, starts believing they really are the genius everyone says they are. Then they get sloppy, overconfident. They stop covering their tracks because they genuinely don't think anyone will challenge them." Marcus said the GitHub commits alone would have sunk him, but the combination of time-stamped files, email acknowledgement of her authorship, technical notebooks, and witness statements, that's not just evidence. That's a prosecution's dream case. Meredith ate her steak, let the conversation flow around her. These people had fought for her when fighting was expensive, and the outcome was uncertain. Frank had spent 6 months building legal strategy. Sarah had taken her case when other attorneys might have worried about going up against a well-funded opponent. Marcus had put his reputation on the line, providing expert testimony. Richard had committed $18 billion based on geological surveys and his assessment of her character. She said, "Thank you, all of you, for believing the evidence even when the easier path would have been to assume Garrison's version was true." Frank's expression was serious. "We didn't believe the evidence because it was easy. We believed it because it was overwhelming. There's a difference." Sarah added, "And honestly, Meredith, you made it easy to believe you. You had documentation. You had timestamps. You had a development history that told a coherent story. Most people who claim they were stolen from can't produce that level of proof. You could because you'd been building the case for years, even before you knew you'd need it." The meal wound down. Coffee arrived then, dessert nobody had room for but ate anyway. The conversation shifted from the evening's drama to next steps, finalizing the Gulf Coast development deal, managing media requests, coordinating with USPTO on the patent interference timeline. Richard said, "I'll have my attorneys draw up the extraction rights contract next week. Assuming the patent invalidation proceeds as expected, we should be able to close by November. Construction on the first drilling platform can begin by spring." Meredith nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about what came after the patent was invalidated and the IPO collapsed and Garrison faced whatever consequences the legal system decided he'd earned, about what it meant to own $20 billion worth of reserves and have the freedom to decide how they'd be developed, about the responsibility that came with that kind of resource and that kind of power. She said, "I want to do this right, the extraction, I mean. Not just profitable, but sustainable. The algorithm I wrote improves efficiency and reduces waste. I want the physical drilling operation to follow the same principles." Richard's eyes lit up with something that might have been approval. "You're thinking long-term. That's rare in this industry. Most people see reserves like that and think about extracting as much as possible as fast as possible. Maximum return, minimum concern for environmental impact." Meredith touched the bracelet. "Nana Joe saved for 3 years to buy that land. She worked doubles until her back gave out. I'm not going to honor that sacrifice by destroying the land for short-term profit. We do this carefully, or we don't do it at all." Frank smiled. "That's going to cost more. Sustainable extraction always does. But I think you've got enough cushion in a $20 billion deal to absorb the expense." Sarah asked, "What are you going to do with the money? After the deal closes, after you've set up the drilling operation and paid everyone who helped you get here, what comes next?" Meredith hadn't let herself think that far ahead, had been so focused on proving the theft, invalidating the patent, protecting what Nana Joe had left her, that she hadn't considered what came after victory. What you did when the fight was over and you were left standing in the wreckage of someone else's empire with resources you'd never imagined having. She said, I think I want to build something. Not a company exactly. Maybe a foundation. Something that helps other women in STEM who've had their work stolen or their contributions erased. Legal support, documentation, resources, mentorship. A structure that makes it harder for people like Garrison to get away with theft because the victims have access to the same quality of legal representation he had. Frank's expression was thoughtful. That's a good use of resources. And it addresses a real problem. Most people who get their IP stolen can't afford to fight. They take the settlement, sign the NDA, and watch someone else get rich off their innovation. You could change that dynamic. Richard added, I know some people who'd be interested in contributing to something like that. Investors who've seen this pattern and want to help break it. You'd have support if you decided to move forward. The evening wound down. They paid the bill. Richard said it was his pleasure to buy dinner for someone who'd just executed the most satisfying takedown he'd witnessed in years. They walked out into Manhattan night, the city somehow quieter than it had been hours before when they'd left the plaza. Richard's driver was waiting. He offered rides, but Frank and Sarah had their own cars, and Marcus was staying at a hotel 3 blocks away. They said their goodbyes on the sidewalk, professional handshakes that carried warmth earned through shared purpose. Richard said to Meredith, My office will be in touch Monday. We'll start the formal contract process. But I want you to know what you did tonight took courage. A lot of people would have settled, would have taken the money and stayed quiet. You chose truth even when truth was expensive. That matters. Meredith watched him drive away, then walked the 6 blocks back to her hotel. The night air was cold but not unpleasant, and she needed the time to process everything that had happened. The confrontation, the evidence, the moment when Garrison's face had shifted from confident to confused to devastated. The investors streaming toward exits. Kendra walking away without looking back. Victoria standing alone near the bar, probably already calculating how to spin this disaster into something that wouldn't completely destroy the Ashford family reputation. Her phone buzzed as she reached the hotel. Darla texting from her shift at Emory, news alerts are insane. Ashford Energy IPO canceled after patent fraud exposed. CEO's ex-wife produces evidence of stolen algorithm. Richard Hale backs fraud claims, says evidence is overwhelming. Tell me everything. Meredith called instead of texting. Darla answered on the first ring, voice breathless. I'm on break, but I only have 15 minutes, so talk fast. What happened? Are you okay? Is Garrison in jail yet? Meredith laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. Not in jail. Not yet anyway. But the IPO is definitely dead. Frank presented all the evidence in front of 400 investors. GitHub commits emails, technical notebooks, expert testimony. It was pretty devastating. Darla made a sound of pure satisfaction. I wish I could have seen his face. That man has been condescending to you for 10 years. 10 years of acting like you were lucky to be associated with his success when you were the one who built everything that made him successful. Meredith said. His face went gray, like all the blood just drained out. And then Kendra left, just grabbed her purse and walked out without even saying goodbye. I almost felt bad for him. Darla's voice was fierce. Don't you dare feel bad for a man who stole 16 years of your work and tried to erase you from your own story. He made his choices. He chose theft and fraud and cruelty. He gets to live with those consequences. Meredith reached her hotel room, kicked off her shoes, sat on the bed. Richard Hale announced the Gulf Coast deal in front of everyone. $16 billion in oil, $4 billion in gas, $20 billion total. You should have seen the investors' faces when they realized I owned reserves worth more than Garrison's entire company. Darla was quiet for a second. $20 billion, Meredith, that's generational wealth. That's change the world money. Meredith touched the bracelet, felt the familiar smooth warmth. Nana Jo bought that land for $8,000 because she wanted me to have ground nobody could take from me. She had no idea it was worth billions. She just knew I needed something that was mine alone. Darla's voice gentled. She would be so proud of you. Not for the money, for fighting back, for refusing to let Garrison steal your story and pretend it was his. They talked for another 10 minutes until Darla's break ended and she had to get back to her patients. Meredith promised to visit Atlanta soon to sit on Darla's couch with expensive wine and tell the whole story in the kind of detail that only best friends got access to. Promised to take care of herself, to eat actual food, to sleep more than 4 hours a night. After they hung up, Meredith sat in the quiet hotel room and let herself feel everything she'd been holding back during the confrontation. The rage at Garrison's theft, the grief for the marriage she'd thought was partnership, the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting for 6 months to prove something she'd known was true all along. But underneath all of that was something else, something solid and unshakable. The knowledge that she'd done what Nana Joe had taught her to do, built on ground that belonged to her alone. Spoke truth even when lying would have been easier. Refused to let theft become the final word in her story. Her phone lit up with news alerts. The story was spreading faster than she'd anticipated. Major outlets picking it up, tech blogs analyzing the GitHub evidence, business journalists calling it one of the most clear-cut cases of patent fraud they'd seen in years. Some of the headlines were sensationalist: billionaire ex-wife destroys cheating husband's IPO, but others got it right. Engineer proves fraud in landmark patent dispute. Gulf Coast landowner exposes IP theft at tech celebration. One article from a female journalist at Wired particularly caught her attention. The piece focused not on the drama of the confrontation, but on the systematic erasure Meredith had experienced. The website bio removal, the meeting exclusions, the gradual disappearing of her contributions until she was invisible in the company she'd helped build. The writer drew connections to larger patterns in tech, to research showing how women's contributions were consistently undervalued and undercredited to the structural issues that made Garrison's theft possible in the first place. The article ended with a quote Meredith had given Sarah to pass along: "The only thing they can't take from you is what you build on ground that belongs to you alone. My grandmother taught me that. Tonight, I proved she was right." Meredith read the article twice, then shared it with Darla and Frank and Sarah. She thought about the foundation she'd mentioned at dinner, about creating infrastructure that made it harder for people to steal credit and easier for victims to fight back. About turning her grandmother's 60 years of saved tips and intuition into something that could help women she'd never meet fight battles she wouldn't live to see. She pulled out her laptop and started making notes. Not a formal plan yet, just ideas. Legal defense fund for women whose IP had been stolen. Technical documentation resources to help engineers protect their work. Mentorship programs connecting junior women with senior advocates who could help navigate situations where credit was being erased. Database of attorneys willing to take these cases at reduced rates or pro bono for people who couldn't afford to fight. The work felt right in a way that the past 6 months of legal strategy hadn't. That had been defensive reactive, focused on protecting what was hers and proving what Garrison had stolen. This was generative, forward-looking, building something new instead of just reclaiming what had been taken. She worked until her eyes burned and her back ached from hunching over the laptop. When she finally closed the computer, Manhattan was still awake outside her window, the city that never slept living up to its reputation. Somewhere out there, Garrison was probably fielding calls from attorneys and board members and investors demanding explanations he couldn't provide. Victoria was probably strategizing with Preston about damage control and reputation management. Kendra was probably already moving on to whatever opportunity she'd identified as her next stepping stone. But Meredith was here in a hotel room that cost more than her monthly rent in Houston, with a bracelet on her wrist that had absorbed 60 years of a waitress's determination, and a plan in her laptop that could change how women in STEM fought back against theft. She touched the gold one more time, felt the metal warm from her skin. "I did it, Nana Joe. I built on the ground you gave me. I spoke the truth you taught me to value, and now I'm going to use what you left me to help other women do the same." The bracelet didn't answer, of course, but Meredith could almost hear her grandmother's voice anyway, the quiet strength that had carried both of them through harder times than this. "Good girl. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow you start building again." Meredith smiled and turned off the light. Tomorrow she'd start building. Tonight she'd rest in the knowledge that she'd fought for truth and won, that she'd honored the woman who'd raised her, that she'd proven the only foundation worth having was the one that belonged to you alone. Outside, Manhattan kept moving. Inside, Meredith Callaway, engineer-innovator, granddaughter of a woman who'd understood that survival meant patience and justice meant proof, finally let herself sleep.